All right, guys, welcome to Standard 6. Standard 6, as you can see, is boom and bust. We're going to talk about the 1920s, a period of great economic growth and expansion, and the 1930s when kind of everything falls apart. This is a relatively long unit, so make sure you've got your stuff. And as always, feel free to email me if you have any questions anytime in this. Just to get things going, let's jump into it and see what we've got. So just to kind of set the stage, I want to remind you of where we are. So the United States has just gone through World War I. The war is over. We are kind of in a way, the last man standing. Like Europe is there, but man, it's really been, there's been a heavy toll taken on it because of the war economically, and its manufacturing. Everything is in shambles, and we aren't. We were so far removed from it that really our economy is going very well. Our agriculture is going well. Things are great. And then we kind of go from this period where we're growing, and it all just totally disappears. So we're going to talk about that story. One of the first things that we're going to talk about as a real change in the 1920s is that in the 1920s, we have for the first time a majority of our industry being connected to electrical power. So we no longer have to use coal to power everything. And there are a number of ways that we generate that electricity. But this is a shift. This is great for manufacturing. It's cheaper. It's cleaner. But already we can see that there's going to be a little bit of a negative to it because the coal miners who have been working for a long time to get more coal are not going to be doing quite as well. So this is the way things are going to go for a while. We have a number of really good areas, and then there's often a less than silver lining, if you would allow me that. So let's talk, for example, about farmers. Farmers during World War I were doing great stuff. They were producing all kinds of grain and wheat and whatever we need. But when the war is over, we continue to produce at the same high levels we did during the war, and that's not great. The reason it's not great is that now all those European farmers who just a year or two ago were fighting in World War I are back to farming. All those fields that were bombed out during World War I are now things that we can use to actually grow crops again. And that's bad because, as you can see here in this picture, there's a real surplus of grain and other things that we'd grow. Well, anytime you've got a surplus, if you know your econ, you've got too much of something, prices are going to start to drop. We talked about this in the late 1800s when we had the populists and William Jennings Bryan and all that, and here it happens again. So just like back then, a lot of farms are going to be foreclosed on. Around the same time that you have that going on, we have another change. The change is that Henry Ford comes up with this idea of the assembly line. Now, you say, no, Henry Ford invented the car. Not really. He's just the guy who figures out that we can make the car much faster and more efficiently if we just set one guy there, and what he does is, man, he puts on the wheel. And all day he puts wheels on the car and tightens up, maybe he tightens up the nut too, and then it goes down and somebody else does the next step of the process, okay? But he says things are going to go faster, it's going to be more efficient if we just have one guy do one thing. Now, think about what it would be like if you didn't have this. So you've got one guy who builds the entire car from scratch. Well, now you've got to have a lot of specialized knowledge. You've got to know how to do the whole thing. You have to have a decent amount of education. When Henry Ford introduces this idea of the assembly line, you can take any old Joe off the street and teach him how to put a tire on the car, okay? So this is going to reduce the price of a lot of things, and it makes it so, boy, we can produce all kinds of new items because you don't have to be a genius to produce them anymore. You need a genius to come up with the idea, but then after it's come up with, man, we can get anything to market. And so we start to mass produce lots of things. This is when you first see refrigerators and irons and vacuums and washing machines, and all of it's relatively inexpensive. And as you would imagine, this is stuff that's going to make life better. And think in the back of your head, whose life is going to be mostly improved by this? Who is, at that time, largely staying at home, taking care of all these things? Well, women. Women's lives, in particular, are going to change in drastic ways. I think you're going to see an immediate result to that as we dig into this a little further. Now, again, there's a downside because if you were a skilled worker before, you no longer are needed. Like if you're a guy who has the knowledge to build an entire car from scratch, well, so what? We don't need that. We have the assembly line. We have people who just put tires on cars all day, and that's all they do. So those guys are now out of jobs, in favor of people who are just grunts. And this is going to make the gap between the rich and the poor grow even wider than it was before. The guys who own the Ford plant are getting rich. The guys who are working in the Ford plant, sure, they're happy to have a job. Maybe they didn't before, but they're not getting quite as wealthy. Okay? So you might think, well, why don't they just join unions? Well, remember, people are still believing that unions are primarily socialist organizations that are tied to anarchy and that kind of thing. Remember the Haymarket Square riot, the Pullman strike, all that. And so there's this idea that if you join a union, you're kind of un-American. And so people really aren't going to do that during this period. Now you might say, how do people buy all these things if there's a big gap between rich and poor? Well, in this time period, we introduced the idea of buying things on credit in a mass scale. Okay, so a lot of companies, or a lot of like Sears, that kind of store, starts to offer buy now, pay later programs or installment plans. Now, I should warn you, I show a picture there of credit cards. Credit cards aren't going to show up in the 1920s, okay? But buying on credit does. Credit cards are going to come later, like the 1950s. But if you think about the effect this is going to have on the economy, buy now, pay later, it's going to stimulate the economy because I want a toaster, I want a I want a refrigerator, I want a radio. I don't have the money, but I can go and get it right now. And the bank will let me borrow the cash. The store gets all the money for those things, and they give the money to the factory that made those things. And the factory says, now we've got some cash. So we can spend it on hiring more people or making more things. And that does stimulate the economy. Okay, that's a good thing. The problem is that this changes how Americans look at debt. Prior to this, a lot of Americans looked at this as debt is bad. You want to stay away from debt at all costs. And now people start to think, well, I can get into a little bit of debt because, man, if I do, now I can get I can get a refrigerator. And it's fine. It's great. But ultimately, this is going to lead us into some really unhealthy habits that could hurt us. Okay? What happens if people have lots of debt and then they lose their job, for example, and they can't pay it off? Is that going to continue to help the economy grow as a little bit of debt does, or is that going to do damage? Well, I think you can see that's going to do damage, which is what I mentioned there. So because there is this new availability of funds, real or imagined, you start to see a lot of advertisement during this time period that is specifically aimed at families. So here we've got an advertisement for vanilla. Wholesome desserts can be delicious. Or maybe you can go and buy a car. Sensational achievement in beauty and performance. And look, it's only $585. But remember, there's a huge amount of inflation that's happened since then. So don't think, boy, that was cheap, because it's still a lot of money. But the idea is now you can go buy a car. Or this, go buy coffee. And I throw this one in there because, not because coffee is expensive and you have to take out a loan to get it, but it's a little bit, actually it's a lot sexist, I think, but that's a prevailing attitude at the time. The guy says, I want a wife, Annette, who will give me coffee like this. So advertising is definitely going to reflect the common attitudes of the time, even if the attitudes of the time are pretty sexist. And lots of other things. Over here on the left, you see a vacuum cleaner. We've got a waffle iron. Down on the right, I think we have a sewing machine. But lots of things are going to start to show up in advertising, because the idea is you can get it if you take out a loan or if you buy an installment plans. Okay? So, like I said, this is going to change the life for women in some pretty drastic ways, because women can now spend a lot less time doing chores than they did before. Can you imagine washing your clothes by hand all the time? Like, that's difficult. The problem is that working class women couldn't necessarily afford these things. Okay, middle class women who could afford these things would go ahead and buy them, but then they just fire their helpers, their maids or whoever they were, in favor of just doing these things on their own. And so even though, yeah, it makes life better for middle class women, the maids who get fired, that actually makes their life worse. So even though this does change things for women over a period of time, the immediate change is not a huge gain. There's not an immediate change in status for women from these things. Some women's lives are better, but a lot of women are now out of work that weren't before. Now, there is a real gain in the 1920s, or I should say during World War I for women, in that when men went off to fight in World War I, you have a lot of women who had to take jobs. They had to work. But when the men came home, most of these women went back to their homes, homemaking like they did before. The one big thing here is that they have a real attitude for, you know what, we can do the same thing that men can do. We want some more rights, and so you're going to see that come about. In fact, we've talked about the fact, last semester we talked about how women wanted the right to vote. Since the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, women had advocated for suffrage, and remember, suffrage is another word for the right to vote. And in the West, as this map shows, women had voting rights even before the 19th Amendment was passed. It's only really in the East and in the South, primarily anyway, that you don't have a lot of voting rights. That's that kind of yellow, orangish, polka dotted section on the map. There we go. Women are continuing to lobby for the vote the whole time. Remember, they said they would make politics more moral. If you vote for us, we'll change everything. And again, this is really review from before, so if you forgot some of that stuff, you might want to go look at your old notes. The 19th Amendment is passed in the 1920s, and it's largely as kind of a thank you for women going to help in industry during World War I. But remember, it doesn't really change politics. Women tended to vote in the same way that their husbands did if they were married, and so politics doesn't become that much more moral. And in fact, women do a lot of jobs that are considered traditional throughout all the 1920s. So teachers, nurses, telephone operators, secretaries, you don't see a big change in how society views women in the 20s. Now, there are some new opportunities, but they're not necessarily great. You could be a domestic servant, you could be a factory worker, a sweatshop laborer, but women overall aren't going to make quite as much money as men are, which even today, as you're aware, is still very much an issue. Now, as cities grew and a lot of people moved from their homes into the big city, there are going to be some new attitudes about gender and the roles and how men and women should interact. A lot of people start to freak out that morals were declining. You've probably heard of the flappers. Okay, now these look like just kind of tame, innocent women to us today. But back in the 1920s, the flappers were seen as these very immoral women. I mean, look at the fact that you can see their knees, you can see their shoulders, they don't have any sleeves. These women are seen as very immodest. And they do. They ignored the cultural and the sexual norms, but that's both gender and how men and women interacted. Remember, this is a society that doesn't view sex the way that a lot of America does today. I'm not getting into whether that's right or wrong, but it just viewed it differently. And so for women to be like, I'm independent, you can't tell me what to do, I'm going to do whatever I want with whoever I want, makes these flappers a symbol of freedom to some or rebellion to others. And you see this reflected in like The Great Gatsby and a lot of movies and plays and things from the 1920s. In reality, though, most women in the 20s are staying home and they're fulfilling their traditional roles. So if you're saying, yay, women are changing and they can do what they want to, the 20s, there are changes, but it's not really a period where we see a lot of moves toward equality happen. I think I'm going to have to make one more video because this is going to be just a hair too short. I'll pick up with transportation on the next video. So join me for the second half of Standard 6.1. And I'll see you there in just a minute, I hope.